Here are the seed heads of our different turf grasses. Okay, so let's start from the right of the screen. Seashore paspalum bahia grass. Basically, almost the same seed head, which is a V shape. Okay, V shape that carries a lot of seeds. I don't know if you actually know why the seed head of seashore paspalum and bahia grass are almost identical, but the reason why that is, it's because they are two species of the same genus, which is the genus Paspalum. Okay, Paspalum vaginatum would be seashore paspalum, Paspalum notatum would be bahia grass. And in this case, this doesn't really help us out because the seed heads are so similar. However, the thing is, bahia grass flowers way more than seashore paspalum. As a matter of fact, bahia grass is the grass species that flowers the most. Now we don't really see a lot of bahia grass here where we at because what happens is that bahia grass is a species that requires not only likes but requires at a certain point um, acidic soil. And down south, we usually have soils that are neutral or alkaline. So basically, usually when you pull up a soil sample, chances are that your soil is higher than 7. Soil pH is higher than 7, hence don't really see much of bahia grass. But if you go from Orlando north, if you take Turnpike, as soon as you hit Kissimmee, everything you see on the roadside is basically bahia grass, and the most flowering species we have. Other than that, Saint Augustine grass, if you guys mow your own Saint Augustine grass, or if you mow all Saint Augustine grass every week, let's say, you will never see the seed head, but this is basically a spikelet. And we're going to talk a lot about St. Augustine grass flowers in a minute because we will talk, we can identify different cultivars of St. Augustine grass depending on their flowers. And then we have zoysia grass, which is a single spikelet, but way thinner than St. Augustine grass. And then Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass has actually 3 to 5. Okay, that's the key to identify Bermuda grass when it flowers. It has 3 to 5 spikelets. In this case, you see some that has 4. Now, the problem is most of the time we actually use sterile hybrids of Bermuda grass down here in South Florida, so you will never literally see the flower. And then finally, we do see St. Augustine grass, which is super hard to see flower because it's really prostrate. And we when we mow it, you don't really see much. So, saying that, the flower or the inflorescence is the easiest, the seed head, which is, they're all synonym, is the easiest way to identify a grass. But as we said, since we mow it down, we actually need to look for other botanical keys to identify the grass that's in your yard. Now, bunch type, as we said, we grow them up north in northern part of the United States. You don't really see much here, so we don't care. And rhizomes and stolons are actually hard to find, and therefore we actually need to take a look at leaves. But how? A specific part of the leaves, and technically the specific part of the leaves are those parts that are attached to the stem. Okay, these parts are called ligule, auricule. We're not really gonna talk about it, and vernation. We're gonna start from the vernation. What is the vernation? The vernation is the description of how the new leaf blade emerges from the stem. Okay, so basically for our grasses, where we have stolons. The stolons is the stem. The stem grows horizontally. The leaves branches out of the stem, and that is what you need to check. And then the second thing would be the ligule, and the ligule, and it's this one. It's the region where the blade and the sheath, the blade and the sheath here joins. Okay, several type of ligule. Anyway, let's start from the vernation, which once again, it's actually the part of the leaves that branches out of your stem, which in this case is your stolon. There are two type of vernation. Folded, okay, so imagine a leaf literally coming out folded in half from the stem, and this is typical of St. Augustine grass, centipede grass, Bermuda grass, and seashore paspalum, or rolled, and rolled is zoysia grass and bahia grass, okay? Now, if you have folded vernation and you have these four options, and especially one and two, are Bermuda grass and seashore paspalum, are really hard to distinguish by themselves if you're not really an expert. There are some types of Bermuda grass, the really nice looking type, that look like seashore paspalum. So if you have folded vernation, then you need to examine the ligule. And what is the ligule? Once again, is the region where the blade and the sheath joins. Okay? If the ligule has hair and it has a folded vernation, that is for sure Bermuda grass. That is exactly how you identify Bermuda grass. Check, go back, go to your leaves, go where it attaches to the rhizome, check if it has hair. If it has hair, it's Bermuda grass, okay? It's also really important because sometimes Bermuda grass could be invasives, could be an invasive species for our lawn, and if you're not really sure, go get a sample. If you don't have flower, go get a sample and check the vernation. Folded, yes or no. If it's folded, check if it has hair. If it has hair, it's Bermuda grass. Okay. Um, if it's membranous, so basically it means no hair, it can be centipede grass or it can be seashore paspalum. So if the vernation is rolled, okay, so the leaf sheet is not folded, then you examine the ligule to know if it's bahia grass or zoysia grass. Once again, zoysia grass has hair, okay. Bahia grass is membranous, which means it does present these ligules that come out of um, the stolon. Okay, uh, those are basically your keys, botanical keys, to identify a turf grass species in absence of flower. Most of the time, you don't have the time to actually stop mowing and wait for the grass to produce seed heads, and therefore you actually need to examine this part of the plant to determine which species you're growing. This is extremely important not to know only what species is in your backyard, front yard, lawn, whatever. It's also important to know in case you suspect contamination. That's extremely important. So, said that, we did develop also a key to identify St. Augustine grass cultivars. Why is that important? Well, St. Augustine grass is the queen of our landscape, right? Down here in South Florida, majority of the landscapes are St. Augustine grass, and I really hope you can identify visually St. Augustine grass because it's quite simple. Um, anyway, why is it important to know what's in your St. Augustine grass? Well, Henry told you so. Uh, St. Augustine grass can be attacked by sugarcane mosaic virus. Okay, all St. Augustine grasses get sugarcane mosaic virus. However, there is one specific cultivar of St. Augustine grass that, after it gets infected with sugarcane mosaic virus, um, could develop lethal viral necrosis. What is lethal viral necrosis? Is basically your lawn dying of the virus. And what's that cultivar? It's Floratam. Okay. At the moment that we know of, Floratam is the susceptible cultivar for lethal viral necrosis, meaning that if you do have Floratam and it gets infected by sugarcane mosaic virus in 3 to 5 years, chances are that your lawn is going to develop lethal viral necrosis, it's going to die, and you will have to replace. And when you replace it and you already had lethal viral necrosis, it's not that you can plant Floratam again, because the virus is already there in your soil and it's going to kill the new Floratam as well. Hence, you need to change cultivar. And that is why it's really important to identify a St. Augustinegrass cultivar. Okay. First of all, what is a cultivar? A cultivar is basically a vegetatively propagated clone. Okay. Each plant, when you have a monostand, so when you have one cultivar in your backyard or front yard, that means that each plant is a clone of the next plant. All those plants are genetically identical. Um, if you want to get a practice example, you can think about dogs. Okay, so you have different dog breeds, right? They all dogs, but then you have different dog breeds. More or less, basically, you have all St. Augustine grass, but then you have different St. Augustine grass cultivars. All right. Um, how do we identify St. Augustine grass cultivars? There is one chance that tells you, there is one method that tells you 100% this is what you have, and it's molecular marker. Unfortunately, the problem of molecular markers is that it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of money. Okay, it's also hard to find labs that do molecular markets on your cultivars and whatnot, and it's hard to implement on a large scale for all our customers. Okay, so once again, there is a more practical way that we can all try to do, and it's the morphological way, also called TLAR, which is that looks about right. Okay, we are pretty sure that is going to be that cultivar. So, what are the morphology that we look at when we want to identify St. Augustine grass cultivars? Um, well, first of all, we need to look at the stolon. What is the stolon? Here's a St. Augustine grass stolon, and see how I told you that leaves emerge. Here it is, emerge from the stolon, where the point where leaves emerge from the stolon is called the node. Okay, and here's you see your rolled vernation, as I told you. Basically, the leaf sheet is not folded. Anyway, where the roots and new shoots emerge, you call the node, and the internode is basically the distance in between two nodes. Okay. All right. Different cultivars have completely different morphological traits. Usually stolon are differentiated by thickness, amount of branching, internode length, color of the internodes, and color of the nodes. All these kind of stuff can help us identify what cultivars we are working with. The stolon appearance can can vary great depending on the environment, however, okay? First of all, nutrition. Usually the more you fertilize, the more nodes you gonna have because that plant is going to grow much faster. Shade changes drastically the color of the internode because, as a matter of fact, amount of shade influences mm, the amount of chlorophyll, hence the amount of photosynthesis, but also drought stress influences the color of, well, the color of our grass, first of all, but the color of our stolons as well. So drought stress plants produce pigments that are different other than chlorophyll, and those have different colors. And that's why all these things actually help you no, not help you, but make the plant look completely different. Okay. Generally speaking, more sunlight exposure, you will see more purple internode, and less sunlight exposure, you will see a green internode because that plant is trying to photosynthesize from everywhere it can. Anyway, uh, the diameter, so how thick our stolon is, really can help us out differentiating our cultivars. Why is that? Well, first of all, because out of all the cultivars we have in South Florida, Floratam has usually thick stolons. Okay, really thick stolons, really large diameter. Most of the time, we're talking Floratam. A little bit skinnier diameter, less diameter means Palmetto, Rayleigh, or Seville, which is a dwarf cultivar. Okay. The other thing is the inflorescence or the seed head, exactly the same thing as we said before. Best way to identify a species is your seed head. For St. Augustine grasses is exactly the same. In St. Augustine grass, the flower looks like a head of wheat, more or less, but it looks green. Okay, so upright stolons, so stolons that don't go parallel to the soil and don't grow horizontally, but uprights actually produce the inflorescence. They also have nodes and internodes, but usually when they grow upright, they're thinner than vegetative. Vegetative are the one that produce only leaves. And frequently, each St. Augustine grass produces two seed heads, okay? One on top and one at the bottom. Now, these are literally flowers, okay? If you let them grow enough, St. Augustine grass is gonna flower and even gonna show you some colors. And that is really important because different colors identify different cultivars, okay? Um, the florets, okay, so the color part are usually in St. Augustine grass only on one side of the seeded, okay? Uh, stigma is the female flowers, the female part of the flower, while anther is the male reproductive organ. They emerge from on top of the florets, okay? And then the inflorescence, here it is, this is the floret, here it is, spikelet, and here are the florets. These are called the gloom. The spikelet are partially embedded in the gloom, and you are going to have, here it is, two florets for each spikelet, okay? You have upper and lower gloom, and then you have the plea and the lemma, each floret, which is basically this part, okay? And the lower floret, here it is typically staminate. But basically, bottom line, this is all terminology that are good for botanists. What we are looking for are these parts, the florets. Why is that? And here it is, because stigmas, which are the female structure, which looks like this small feather, can exist in different shades of purple. And different cultivars actually present a different shade of purples. Now, the problem is this color tends to fade and homogenize during the day, okay? Ranges from white to purple, and they all look in similar size. Hence, we rather check at the male structure, which are the anthers. All the males or the male part of a St. Augustinegrass flower are yellow, but the size is the big difference. And once again, Floratam, and as a matter of fact, Provista, because Provista is genetically modified Floratam, um, have the biggest anthers. Okay? Really straightforward big anthers means you have either Floratam or Provista. Citrablue, the new St. Augustinegrass cultivar released from University of Florida, on the other hand, look like the anthers are two half moon shapes joined together. Palmetto and Rayleigh is more or less basically something in between Floratam and Citrablue, while Seville, which is our dwarf cultivar, you have the both answer, both anthers tied together. Okay. The sleepers, that's not really a sleeper is not a scientific name, but that's how it's called. That's how you identify the different St. Augustinegrass cultivars. Okay. So stigma and anthers color are very, very consistent, usually from one cultivars to the other. Okay. Each of these color and shape represents a different genotype, hence it's an indicator of different cultivars. And if the stigmas are purple, that color can fade. But if the stigma, so the female part, is always white, white does not turn into purple. Okay, so purple could potentially turn into white, white does not turn into purple ever. And here's more or less a visual identification of cultivars. So Floratam, what you want to look at are long, thick, purple internodes. Okay, Provista is going to look a lot like Floratam. What is Provista? Again, is genetically modified Floratam to be glyphosate resistant. Okay, that's basically what it is. Citrablue, which is the new cultivar, has really thick stolons but super short internodes. Super short internodes, and the grass actually grows more horizontally than vertically. All the three has purple stigmas, and basically here you see the really long sleepers for anthers for Floratam. Same, really long anthers for Provista. Okay. In Citrablue, on the other hand, you do not see the long straight anthers, but you see them a little bit folded. Okay. Same goes for Riley and Seville. They're more on the whitish side. Okay. Sorry. Riley and Palmetto are more on the whitish side. Here you see the flowers, white stigmas, anthers that are not as yellow and not as big as Floratam. And also, their growth habit, their stolons are usually greenish. They're not as purple as Floratam. Okay. Seville, it actually has a really tiny, the smaller anther and light purple color. Palmetto was released in 95. It's a selected Florida cultivar that does well under shade. It's a semi-dwarf. Okay, it's not completely dwarf, which means that you can mow it pretty much anywhere from 2.5 to 3.5 inches. Okay, it's produced and used all over in throughout Florida, and it's fertile, so it produces viable seeds. Said that you will probably never seed palmetto. You will always, anyway, only sod it. And here it is, white stigma, yeah, but yellow anthers, light yellow anthers, always white stigmas. So the stigmas of palmetto will never, never, ever turn purple. Diploid and semi-dwarf, and it produces a really, really dense canopy with green stolons and nodes. Okay, Riley, if you are down South Florida, don't use it. Riley was was bred for cold tolerance. It's actually, I don't know with the really newest release, but for 3, 4 decades was the golden standard for cold tolerance. Okay. Now the problem is that is not really a trait we care about in Palm Beach, Broward, Miami, Naples. Hence, it's not really good for South Florida, and its use is basically strict, limited to the Florida Panhandle. Also fertile cultivar, which produces flowers with white stigmas, yellow anthers. Okay, dense canopy, green stolons and nodes, and it produces really long leaves. Okay. Seville is a diploid semi-dwarf. This was also used and produced for high shade tolerance. It was released in 79 from the Scots company, and it still defends itself, still pretty good here in Florida. Since we categorize it as a dwarf cultivar, we do not want you to mow it any higher than 2.5 inches. Okay, a regular Saint Augustinegrass, you go 4, 3.5, 4. Seville, you wanna keep it short. Um, it has mostly white stigmas, so the female part, the one that look like little feathers, um, slightly purple, and yellow to golden anthers. So the anthers, the male part, they are shorter and they are way more dark yellow than the two previous cultivar. It does produce a really dense canopy, and here we start seeing the nodes and the stolons that are not as green as the two previous cultivars, but start to get into a reddish color. Still not as much as Floratam. Floratam is literally, well, it was released in 72, Floratam, okay, so Florida and Texas A&M joint venture. It has, at the time when it was released as a resistant to southern chinch bug, but that resistance, we lost it. Now we have chinch bugs that actually attack Floratam as well. Um, it's resistant, not highly, but it is resistant to large patch. The problem is it doesn't do as well as in shade, and the main problem is that it's gonna get killed by lethal viral necrosis. If sugarcane mosaic virus attacks it, then it's going to develop lethal viral necrosis. Also, it's quite of a little bit of a starving cultivar, which means you have to fertilize pretty frequently to have decent results. Really purple stigmas and really golden long anthers. The nodes and the stolons are long, thick, and purple. Okay. Provista, exactly like Floratam, released in 2017 by Scott's Miracle Grow, uh, resistance to glyphosate. Um, the color similar to Provista and to Floratam, resisted diseases as much as Floratam. We don't really know much about lethal viral necrosis yet. Okay, we don't have those data yet. Um, just like Provista, you need to fertilize it just as much. And basically, the flower are going to look exactly like Floratam, and the stolons are going to look purple, but shorter internodes compared to Floratam, which has quite long internodes. And then finally, Citrablue, which is the last release by UF in 2018. Um, it has a decent drought tolerance when it's under shade. When it's under full sun, I wouldn't say its drought tolerance is the best, but under shade, it can resist drought fairly well. It has good disease resistance to large patch. It's quite good to take or root rot and gray leaf spot. Um, Moderate chinch bug tolerance, so chinch bug can attack it. It's susceptible to caterpillars. The main problem of Citrablue is that it has a really aggressive horizontal habit and so produces a lot of touch. And that means that when you walk on it, looks like you're walking on a trampoline almost. Um, the stigmas are mostly purple, a little bit of white, golden anthers, banana shaped anthers. The canopy is incredibly dense because of its horizontal growth, and the stolons are thick and purple, but the internodes are super short, and then you can see it produces a lot of leaves really close to the stolon. So basically, here's a key to identify your cultivars starting from the flowers. We start here. Is the stigma completely white, so you have nothing, no purple whatsoever. If the answer is yes, you either have Palmetto or Riley. Texas Common or Classic, they're not sold at the moment. You can have them in all the loans. Okay. If your stigmas can have some purple, okay, but if they are completely purple and are glyphosate tolerant, they're going to be Provista. But if they are completely purple, then it's going to be Floratam. If it's a mix between white and purple, then you need to check, are they mostly purple with some white? Then you're going to have Citrablue. But the other way around, if the stigmas are mostly white with some purple, then you're going to have Seville. Okay? That's basically the key you need to follow to identify your cultivar based on the flower. What if I don't have any flower? Well, first of all, rule out what it's not. Okay, so like for instance, Citrablue is really peculiar and really distinct. You can just say no, that's clearly what I do not have. Trying to find overhanging stolons and try to see the color of those kind of stolons, if they're mostly purple or if they're greenish, and then check the growth habit over time, for instance, is it a dwarf cultivar like Seville? Do you mow it short and it does well? Then it's most likely Seville, or is it a cultivar I need to mow a little higher? If you really cannot identify anything else, then send it to us and we'll see what we can do. Now, there are some limitations, like for instance, really, really old lawns, you may be working with off types. It could be some mix progeny from fertile cultivars, or something that mutated along the line. Or maybe in home loans there were a lot of different cultivars. Sometimes the lawn was renovated and different cultivars were mixed together. Off types, usually when you have an off type within your yard, you should be easily distinguishable from a cultivar because they have two different, completely different colors, and that visual effect you usually may not like it, or sometimes they appear extremely similar, and then at that point, who cares? They look almost the same, and we all good. Keep in mind that to make absolutely sure about the difference in cultivars, we need to use molecular market, but that takes a lot of money. Okay, and most likely sometimes it's actually some cost that you do not want to carry, or you do not care to the money you do not care to spend to actually differentiate it. Said that, guys, these and way more, not these was presented, but way more will be presented at my field day, which is the 36th South Florida Turfgrass Field Day and Expo. Is going to be held here at Fort Lauderdale Research and Education Center in Davie on March 27 from 7:30 until 3 p.m. We have education for everybody. Our landscape tours this year for the first time are going to be in English, and then we're gonna have a full landscape tour, field tour in Spanish. And then for the first time this year, we even gonna have a Creole translator, okay? So if you do not feel comfortable about English, coming to the field and not understanding English, absolutely we have options for you. Come to field day. It's $55. We give you breakfast, lunch, education, and 4 CEUs, spray applicator CEUs that we are actually already approved for, okay? You can ask Harry. I'm fairly sure that Harry is going advertise that in his email as well. If you have any question, please let me know. Don't hesitate to ask me or Harry, and Harry can just copy me in his response. But I really hope to see you there. We will be showcasing a lot of zoysia grass research, St. Augustinegrass research, and whatnot. So we're not only going to talk about St. Augustinegrass, we're going to have a lot of different stuff for you to check on our experiments and so on and so forth. Um, Said that, are there any questions? Henry, have you seen if there are questions on the chat? If Henry's there, or if he hasn't leave? Yes, you there?
Uh, Thank you, Marco. No, I don't see any question here. That's very strange.
Oh, well, if anybody has any question, they can open their mic and just let me know.
Well, you cannot question. Uh,
Will you have a turf field day in the Panhandle? Yes. Yes, ma'am. There is the J, so close to Pensacola. The Northwest Florida Turfgrass Field Day historically was happening in June, but I believe they moved it to September. If you are on Henry mailing list, you probably get. Do you want to check your email this summer? Basically, bottom line.
Marco, quick question here. What about social grass? I mean, do
What
you
about
have
it? Yes.
any
Yes.
characteristic to differentiate social?
Two different zoysia grasses. Okay. Um, there are actually two species of zoysia grass: Zoysia japonica and Zoysia matrella. What you see on lawns, and they're really distinct. If you come to field day, you'll see it. What you have on lawns is usually Zoysia japonica. Zoysia japonica has thicker leaf blade, way thicker leaf blade than Zoysia matrella. Sometimes you can go to, I don't know, Home Depot or whatnot, and they tell you Zoysia, this is Zoysia and this is Zoysia, and they look completely different. Why is that? Well, because one is japonica, the other is matrella. The one that you use in landscape, which is japonica, it does not look as pretty. And I realized that. On the other hand, it's way more drought tolerant, it's way more cold tolerant, and it's way more disease tolerant than Zoysia matrella. So Zoysia matrella looks super pretty. It almost looks like one of those grasses from the north, so like ryegrass and Kentucky bluegrass. However, it's really susceptible to environmental stresses.
What about Empire? Empire is like a
Empire is japonica.
Japonica,
Yeah,
right?
that's usually the most common one you have. Yeah, down here.
Okay, and what about all of the cultivars of other grasses?
Almost impossible to distinguish, and you really uh, you don't want to get into cultivar of Bermuda grass because for landscape, probably use celebration. That's as easy as that. Cultivar for Bermuda grass, most of the time, what happens is you care only if you live on a golf course, and usually golf course superintendents are managing that for you. So uh, the different cultivars is mostly for on a landscape point of view. It's more important that you know the Saint Augustinegrass different types.
Okay, do you need to change fertilizers or other treatments depending the cultivar?
Yes, yes, that's actually an amazing question. If we're talking, and these we're going to show it these during field day. Citrablue, because of its color, needs way less fertilizer than Floratam. Now, our recommendation are mostly based on Floratam, and Floratam is more a starving looking cultivar of St. Augustine grass. Hence, the recommendations are higher. But if you have an older lawn with a lot of organic matter or a dwarf cultivar like Seville or Citrablue, you can decrease your fertility. Also, remember that find a good fertility schedule for you that is within the UF-IFAS recommendation, and work with that. Mm, Over fertilizing your grass is not gonna help you with anything, and fertilizing your grass when you are during a cold spell, like for instance, we just had a cold spell in January, like that doesn't really help you with anything either.
What about the irrigation? Do you need to adjust the irrigation?
Yes, you need to adjust irrigation always, but always remember that our recommendation is that you need to irrigate turf grass only when the grass needs it. So when the grass starts going into stress, the good thing about St. Augustine grass is that it basically is telling you, hey, I'm getting thirsty. Okay, I'm getting thirsty. I'm getting thirsty. You see the grass turning grayish, purplish, and folding the leaves, and that is when you irrigate. Do not keep your irrigation system running every 15 days, every 15 minutes each night, because that's not really that good.
Floratam, and the most popular one, Floratam and Palmetto. I mean,
Yes.
really, the irrigation and fertilization are the same or something
Yeah,
different?
yeah. Floratam and Palmetto pretty much the same. The good thing, the difference there is that Palmetto actually you want it where you have more shade, less light. And when you under shade, you also need to water less your lawn because the water that is used and transpired is less under shade than under full sun for obvious reason.
Okay. Tricia is very active. Another pest problem, depending the cultivar?
Okay, so the number one problem at the moment, because really you cannot cure it, it's lethal viral necrosis. The rest, I actually
Mm.
myself, this was a crazy winter. I got large patch for the first time since I bought the house, but I know that St. Augustine grass is gonna grow out of it. So that's cosmetic for 3, 4 how's it called months per year, and then it's gonna grow out of it. Yeah, but the one you really need to worry about is the lethal viral necrosis, and you know that if you have Floratam, that you are exposed to that risk.
All right,
And
let me,
yeah,
there
yeah,
is no
the
more
post
question.
test. Yes.
Yeah, let me try to launch the post test. Please, you can put in the chat. Some questions are not working, the first and the second one. So please put in the chat the answer so we can have some head counts.
What St. Augustinegrass cultivar do you recommend to plant as of 2025? It depends a lot on your needs. If you have a lot of shade, I will go with Seville, okay? Just to be on the safe side. If you don't care about the trampoline effect, I like Citrablue. There are new cultivars that will come to Florida that looks absolutely amazing, and it's called Cobalt. It was developed at Texas A&M. It's not in production in Florida yet, or if it's in production, I don't think they're selling it yet. But that could be a game changer. If not, the truth is, if you mow your own lawn, meaning that nobody comes with contaminated blades, Floratam down here still does the trick. If you have full sun, Floratam is still decent. But you need to mow your own lawn because sugarcane mosaic virus actually spread by mowers. Okay, that's how we get so much sugarcane mosaic virus everywhere.
Okay, yeah, you can put in the chat what is the most susceptible cultivar to lethal viral necrosis.
Yes,
All
Doc,
right.
it's Floratam.
Yes, there is one that is going to die. The other cultivars are going to stay yellow, but they are not going to die. But
Exactly.
there is one that's going to die. Yeah. Thank you.
All right.
All right. So, yep, we have 50% of people say inflorescence is the
Good.
easy way to identify the grass.
And if you do not, it's always the inflorescence or seed head. And if you do not have that, then move to stolons.
Right. And what species of grass produce more seed heads? Yeah, 64% say Bahia grass.
Yeah, correct. All right.
All right.
All right, guys.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shavon. Guys, you're going to receive a survey after we finish here. Thank you very much for attending this seminar, webinar, and have a great weekend.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.